what many did not believe would happen actually happened. Donald Trump was elected, I think, the 47th president of the US. Why he was elected is a separate, obviously, podcast. I won't go into that. But before we talk about Trump moving forward, it's worth just taking a brief look at Joe Biden's record. I would say most Ukrainians inside Ukraine don't have a very good opinion of Joe Biden. They never had a great opinion of Barack Obama anyway, because they felt he betrayed them in 2014 when the US ignored its commitments under the Budapest Memorandum, and actually Obama pressured Ukrainians not to fight for Crimea as well. And then Obama vetoed the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. So in many ways, Biden's administration is a kind of a Obama light. It's similar to Obama, but also, of course, a bit different, because 2022 was very much different in terms of Russian invasion to 2014. But Ukrainians are not happy with Biden and therefore they're not crying for the fact he's left office. And they were worried that Kamala Harris would kind of continue Biden's policies. And they were not happy with Biden because he was way too cautious. And the American administration, like the Germans, who were always hiding behind the Americans, never once said what their goal was in this war. Unlike, say, the Brits, the 4 Scandinavians, the 3 Balts, the Poles, the Czechs, the Romanians, they all said openly their goal was Russia's military defeat, which of course meant Ukraine's victory. The Americans in particular never said that. They never actually said our goal is Russia's military defeat. They just said, you know, we're going to make sure Ukraine's not defeated. But what that translates into, if Biden or Kamala Harris would have been re-elected, that would have translated into a never-ending war, because you would have this continuous drip supply of military equipment and no real attempt to kind of give Ukraine an edge so it could defeat Russia. A drip policy and a long drawn-out war is bad for Ukraine for all sorts of reasons that are easy to understand. You know, it means more destruction, more deaths, civilians and military. It means all the millions of refugees abroad will never come back. It means you can't start rebuilding the country. It's just non-stop Ukraine also begging for financial aid to keep the budget afloat. I mean, all of that, it's not good. Ukraine's interest is to have the war end quickly as possible. So Biden's policy wasn't great on that. And then, you know, the other things that they complained about, the Biden administration, they complained about Ukraine launching attacks inside Russia against energy facilities. Then they complained or refused to give permission to Ukraine to use US weapons inside Russia. So Ukrainians felt that they were fighting the war with one arm tied behind their back. Russia could do what the hell it wanted, and Ukraine could not. That permission to fire inside Ukraine is being supported by everybody in Europe. The Brits, Scandinavians, the French even, all have said that Ukraine should be allowed to use weapons inside Russia. The Dutch have just supplied F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, and they've said they have zero problem in them being used inside Russia. So this is only the Americans. This is particularly Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, who I don't think some of his 2 things haven't fallen yet, and he's just that fear of escalation has meant that this was a very an administration that never really wanted to take on Russia, even though the escalation was always coming from the Russian side. The hybrid warfare all around Europe taking place. For example, just this week, the information about Russia putting bombs on flights to Canada and the US. and also the North Koreans arriving in Europe to fight in the war against Ukraine. I mean, this makes a complete joke of the American position that Russia is less important. We're going to park Russia and we're going to focus on China and East Asia. Well, I'm sorry, guys, it's too late. East Asia, China, and North Korea have come to Europe already. And there's already an alliance there of Iran, Russia, North Korea, China, fighting against the West. So the Biden administration was better than Obama, but only to some extent. And I think the big thing that the big piece of history that academics will be writing about in the future is why the Biden administration basically allowed Russia to consolidate its control over southeastern Ukraine. In late 2022, when Ukraine was on a roll, the Ukrainian army was on a real roll. It just liberated Kharkiv. It was liberated Kherson. The Russian army was in retreat. At that stage, there was only 170,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. They still hadn't built fortifications. If at that stage, the Ukrainian army had been given a huge influx of military equipment from the US and elsewhere, the Ukrainian army would have reached the Black Sea, would have reached the Azov Sea. The Russian army would have broken at that stage. That didn't happen. Drip policy, this completely dragged out, and the tanks, and then the jets, and then the missiles was dragged out. It allowed the Russians 9 months from the autumn of 2022 to the summer of 2023 to mass mobilization, to build 3 lines of fortifications, and to lay tens of thousands of mines. Today, the Russian army in Ukraine is close to 500,000. So 3 times, more than 3 times what it was in late 2022. That's a far more difficult army size to fight than then. And that's allowed Russia to consolidate its control over southeastern Ukraine. And let's remember, this is not just occupation. This is mass terror taking place in those occupied areas, Russification, de-Ukrainization, repression, torture, and murder. And this was allowed. This was actually, the fault for this can be laid at the door of the Biden administration for its very timid unwillingness to take the war to the end. If Ukrainians had been given everything in the autumn of 2022 and had broken through Russian lines at that stage, which were very weak, the war would have been over by last year. But it didn't happen, and so this war, a la the Biden administration and maybe Kamala Harris, would have just continued to drag on and drag on. So now we have Trump. Trump, of course, said that he's going to end the war within 24 hours. Well, he's failed already because it's already 24 hours. And he said that he would do that before even becoming president. Well, he hasn't done that. But Trump and Vance, like most American politicians, simply don't understand international relations. They don't understand this war. They don't understand Vladimir Putin, and they don't understand what America is gaining from this war, which I'll explain. So I'm not so pessimistic that this is going to go badly for Ukraine. Why? Well, for one thing, the Trump plan assumes that Putin will roll over and have his belly tickled by Trump. Putin will never listen to Trump. Putin will tell Trump to go take a hike. The idea that Trump comes in, or Vance comes in, and kind of cajoles Putin to sign a peace treaty where he only gets to control what he's already occupied, which is 20% of Ukraine, is simply laughable. Putin's goal has always been the destruction of the Ukrainian state and the destruction of Ukrainian identity and the transformation of this rump Ukraine, minus the southeast south and the east and the Crimea, this what's left of Ukraine, transformation of that into a little Russian puppet state, which would resemble Belarus, with a pro-Russian dictator. That's Putin's goal. At the moment, Russia controls no big major cities, which Russian nationalists claim are Russian cities. Odessa, Kharkiv, Kiev, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, in Russian nationalist eyes, these are Russian cities. The Trump plan doesn't give any of those cities to Russia. It just freezes what Russia already has. So the idea that Putin would like such an agreement is wrong. And the feedback, it's ironic that the reactions in Moscow actually show a better understanding of Trump than what we have amongst Western journalists and think tankers who are in panic mode. In Moscow, they're already saying, this is not for us, this plan. So the idea that Russia would somehow gain from a Trump plan is, I think, a product of this bias we have in the West, that somehow Trump is working for Putin, as it were, that Trump's some kind of Putin puppet. And I think this is completely mistaken. I'm not saying that because I like Trump, not at all, but let's look at the reality on the ground. Now, the Ukrainian position, which everybody, of course, ignores as well, is that Zelensky, as the president of Ukraine, in the constitution, he's not allowed to give up territory. He hasn't got a right to say, okay, that's gone. He has no constitutional right to do that. If he were to consider that kind of peace plan where 20% of Ukrainian territory would stay under Russian control, that would be something that he'd have to put to a referendum. And if it went to a referendum, it would only pass potentially, because I think many Ukrainians don't see an end to the war, don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, so they may be a bit fed up of nightly bombings and everything, so they may vote for something like that in a referendum. But the only way that would really pass is if there was NATO membership included. If Trump is serious about such a plan, where he wants to get the majority of Ukrainians in favor of it, then there's only one scenario I could see would work, where Ukraine would be approached and said, look, nobody's going to recognize this 20% as belonging to Russia. We understand this is recognized as occupied Ukrainian sovereign territory. But let's just freeze the conflict for now to end the bloodshed. You get to keep your 80% of Ukraine, which is not occupied. It gives you peace. It gives you time to rebuild, refugees coming back, etc. People are no longer dying. But the security comes from joining NATO. Now, Trump hasn't said that. Trump said, no, NATO's not on the table. NATO membership's not on the table. And that's a product of the fact that American presidents, all the way through since Obama, Trump, and Biden have all opposed Ukraine's NATO membership. The last US president that supports Ukraine's NATO membership was Bush back in 2008. But that kind of deal, I think, might get support in Ukraine in a referendum only if NATO membership was included. If NATO membership was not included, then I don't think Ukrainians would trust such an agreement to stop the fighting. They would just think that Russia would wait 1 or 2 years, rebuild up its army, and then start again. And they would not trust Western security guarantees. And they would have a point, because Ukraine's already been screwed once with the Budapest Memorandum. And that was one of probably the biggest betrayal out in recent years of Ukraine. Ukraine's security options are threefold only. Joining NATO, the Americans and Germans are blocking this. And it's not a problem that part of Ukraine is occupied. The West German scenario is talked about here. West Germany was allowed to join NATO in the 1950s, even though East Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union. And that occupied part of Germany only went back to Western Germany when they reunited in 1990. So for something like 40 years, West Germany was in NATO and in the EU when a part of its territory was occupied. So that could be the scenario for Ukraine. So three options. NATO membership, that's been blocked by the Americans in particular. Secondly, even though NATO membership for Ukraine, that would actually be something that many Ukrainians would support today. There's massive support for that throughout Ukraine, including in the east. The second option would be some kind of security guarantees. Ukrainians are distrustful of security guarantees because of Budapest memorandum. But anyway, could the West deliver on security guarantees? Which countries in the West would be willing to send in troops if Russia breaks the agreement? Which? Trump has said it won't be Americans. So which countries are going to do that? And most experts say that for security guarantees to be realistic, you would need most NATO members, or at least the key NATO members, to increase their defense spending up to 3% of GDP. That's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for most countries. Most members of NATO have just begun recently spending 2% of GDP on defense. It's now something like 2/3 of NATO's 32 members who spend 2% of defense on GDP. Trump is coming in and saying that should be increased to 3%. And he's absolutely right. It should be, with this new threat coming from Asia and from Russia. But, you know, there are countries like Canada who can't even do 2%. Trudeau has said that Canada won't be able to spend 2% until 2032. And there's about 8 other countries in a similar position. The third option is nuclear weapons, and this is now coming up more and more frequently in Ukraine. If the West is not willing to defend Ukraine, and Ukraine is faced with an existential fight for its very survival, then why can Israel have nukes and not Ukraine? Israel is faced with the same existential threat from Iran. Iran seeks to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. Israel has nukes. I don't see anybody in the West complaining about Israel having nukes. Never. So maybe that's the other option. So NATO membership, security guarantees, or nuclear weapons. I mean, I don't see what other potential there is. Again, we have to also, when all of these issues are debated in the West, nobody seems to take into account the fact that Ukraine is a sovereign country, that Zelensky has said many occasions, including today, at the meeting of the European Political Council in Budapest, he said that Ukraine will not accept territorial revisions to its territorial integrity. He's said that on many occasions. How is any country, including a powerful US, going to be able to pressure Ukraine to do that if it says, no, sorry, we don't agree? Yes, then the Trump plan then says, well, the Americans stopped supplying weapons to Ukraine. Okay, well, if that's going to happen, it's going to happen. But let's remember that up until now, again, what everybody forgets is that it's the Europeans who have been providing the most money to keep the Ukrainian budget afloat, because it's not just a question of military aid, it's also a question of economic financial aid. The Europeans have been giving far more of that than the Americans. And there's going to be a lot more, I would say, arms coming from Europe, and there's a lot more military cooperation between, say, European countries and military factories in Ukraine taking place as well. So I don't think Zelensky would want to say no to something like this, but if Trump tried to pressure him, I don't see how Zelensky could agree. And again, he has a constitutional inability to give away territory. He can't do that legally, constitutionally. But secondly, Zelensky has to look over his shoulder, because you're talking about now there must be over 1 million veterans in Ukraine, a lot of weapons flying around. If Zelensky was ever seen to be, and I don't think he would ever would, if he was ever seen to be betraying Ukraine, there would be a violent Maidan. There would simply be a violent Maidan against him. The Ukrainians, too many Ukrainians have died. There are too many people who have suffered in this war to accept some kind of bad deal with Russia. So Trump looks at these things so simplistically. It's worse than like a first-year student in grad school, literally. I mean, it simply won't be as simple as what he thinks to do a deal, both dealing with Putin and dealing with the Ukraine side. If he really wants to get the Ukrainians on board, then he has to, I think he has to bring NATO membership back to the table, which Trump has not been willing to do. And because that is going to be the one thing that can guarantee a peace deal in Ukraine. It's not the Europeans, and it's not security guarantees, it's NATO membership. And I think that is something that has to be revisited, shall we say. So good luck, Trump. I want to see the look on his face when Putin tells him to go take a hike. The United States military and the United States intelligence are getting huge benefits from working with Ukraine. I don't think that they want this to end. You know, they would be very much against this cooperation ending. US military industrial companies, for example, many of them, as well as European ones, but Americans as well, are using the Ukrainian war as a testing ground for their military equipment. It's the best testing ground in the world. You know, what might go well in a laboratory in, I don't know, Delaware in the US might be really shit on the ground in the war. This is the first full-scale war in Europe since 1945, and the first drone and high-tech war in history. And so many of those companies would be loath to lose that ability to, as it were, test their equipment there. If they find out what needs to be changed, they change it, then they can go into mass production in the US. And that works for the benefit of the US Army. You know, when Ukraine got the HIMARS artillery rocket system from the US back in, I think, late 2022, they were seen as so fantastic, so many other countries ordered them. I think Poland ordered 1,000 of them, if I'm not mistaken. You know, I mean, this is not only a testing ground, it's an advertisement. It's like a shopping mall. You know, you can see this stuff in action. And also, there have been, you know, quite a few articles, including a very long one in the New York Times a few months ago, about how US intelligence services are gaining that much intelligence from working with Ukrainian military intelligence and with the security service from Russia. Again, this would be destroyed if Trump tried to push it too far and Zelensky said back off. So the US intelligence service is getting a huge amount of benefit from that cooperation as well. So I think there's a lot of different areas within the United States sort of security establishment and foreign policy establishment that would want that relationship to continue with Ukraine. So hopefully the country which will trip up first if Trump begins to propose this so-called peace treaty would be Russia. And then Putin turning around to Trump and saying, "Niet," would work in Ukraine's favor. And it could work in Ukraine's favor in a really good way, in the sense that Trump would not be as cautious as Biden. So I don't think Trump would have an idiot like Jake Sullivan as his national security advisor. He'd have at least somebody who's over 18 and somebody whose two things have dropped. He'd have somebody who wouldn't say to the Ukrainians, don't fire American weapons inside Russia. So those kind of restrictions that the Biden administration put on Ukraine would probably not be put on by the Trump administration if the relationship stayed good, as it were. You know, if the Trump administration instead fell foul with Putin. So that actually could work in Ukraine's favor. So I hope Zelensky is good in making sure he knows the right buttons to press with Trump. You know, you have to play up to his ego, etc., etc. We shall see how that goes. But it's certainly not all black and white that Biden was great and Trump's going to be bad. That's really the wrong way to look at this. It's a myth which you have in certain parts of the American right that somehow you can treat China and Russia differently. That's completely not true. Most Western experts believe that this huge trade between China and Russia, which is taking place, where China and India are importing most of the Russian oil, and China is the biggest exporter to Russia now of dual-use goods, which can be used by the military as well. And if China stopped that trade, the Russian military would no longer be able to fight. That's what most experts are now saying. So the idea that somehow China and Russia are two separate entities and two separate threats, we can park Russia, focus on China, you're living in cuckoo land. It's just simply not the real world. The real world is there's an axis, whatever you want to call it, evil, upheaval, chaos, everybody calls it something different. But this axis of four countries, Iran, China, North Korea, and Russia, this axis exists. And this axis of these four countries believe that they are already at war with the West. I don't think everybody in the West understands that. They believe that they are already at war. The North Koreans are already in the war. Ukrainians are already fighting the North Koreans. You cannot separate China and Russia. They are together. China, I think at the beginning of the war was quite reluctant in 2022 to come full way on the side of Russia. But since early 2023, China has been working solidly with Russia because it may not have liked what Russia did initially, the invasion, but because China has a bigger stake in global trade and globalization than Russia has. But at the same time, Chinese believe that it's not in their interest for Russia to be defeated. And so therefore they're going to continue helping Russia. And so there's also another factor as well, Taiwan. The Chinese are watching very closely how the West deals with the war in Ukraine over how they think then the West will deal with Taiwan. Because if the West shows weakness in its support for Ukraine, that sends a signal to the Chinese that if they invade Taiwan, the West will also be weak. So again, you can't separate all of these questions. They all are somehow very closely interlinked. I think this reality of international relations and geopolitics and who the hell they're dealing with, people like Putin, is going to slap people like Trump in the face very quickly. They won't send, of course, troops, but they have already said they've sent or they're sending military advisors, probably intelligence officers who would interrogate troops, North Koreans who were captured, for example. And they may turn an even bigger eye to some of their weapons being exported to Ukraine. I mean, a lot of this international arms trade is just full of hypocrisy. According to the South Korean constitution, they're not allowed to export weapons to any conflict zone. And South Korea, most people don't realize, South Korea is the 10th biggest arms exporter in the world. It's got a fantastic arms industry. The Poles have just bought like a huge number of South Korean tanks. So already South Korean products, military products, including artillery shells, have already arrived in Ukraine, but not directly. You know, they've gone through the Czech Republic or elsewhere. And so I suspect that will just increase, that indirect supply, or the South Koreans will start doing it directly because North Korea's in this. I mean, they obviously are very worried that that North Korea, what does North Korea want? It wants high-level technology, particularly with regard to nuclear weapons, from Russia, and that is what worries South Korea. The country which is completely kind of blasé about this, and this is where the Americans should have greater influence or should have greater willingness to lobby, is Israel. Because look at the difference. South Korea sees the North Koreans coming to the war, and they already become alarmed and start getting involved and start talking to Ukraine. The Iranian-Russian military alliance has existed for 3 years. Iran also wants nukes. And if you think that Russia's not willing to give nuclear technology to Iran, you are completely naive. The doomsday scenario for Israel is if Iran gets nuclear weapons. This is something, for them, it's the major, massive red line. Why then are the Israelis not more concerned about this Iranian-Russian military alliance? And if they are more concerned, why are they not working in a military partnership with Ukraine? Ukraine and Israel both are countries fighting this anti-Western axis. Iran is focusing on Israel, and China, North Korea, Russia on Ukraine. But the axis is fighting both countries. Iran wants to eradicate Israel from the face of the world, face of the earth. Russia wants to eradicate Ukraine from the face of the earth. Ukraine has a Jewish president whose family suffered in the Holocaust. This is an alliance which should have taken place years ago between Israel and Ukraine. And the only reason it hasn't taken place is because Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, was a close buddy of Putin. And he hasn't managed to get away from that, as it were, and break with that and realize that his bed should be in the same bed and same alliance, same with Ukraine, because they're both countries, Israel and Ukraine, are fighting the same countries. So hopefully that should be one area where maybe the Trump administration, which is very close to Netanyahu, can maybe influence as well.